do you top a groundbreaking, revolutionary game such as the first Resident Evil, a game that set the standard for the survival horror genre as we know it? Making a sequel to a game is a very difficult thing to do, but thankfully, the sequel that we got is anything but disappointing. Resident Evil 2, released in 1998 for the original PlayStation and later ported to the Dreamcast, GameCube, and the PC, this is not only one of the greatest PlayStation games of all time, but it's one of the greatest horror games of all time, and one of the greatest sequels of all time. This is a prime example on how to do a sequel right. Take everything that was great about the original and build upon it. And that's what they did. So why is it one of the greatest sequels ever made? And why is it not only one of the best Resident Evils, but one of the best video games of all time? Let's find out why. Actually, I lied. Before I get into the game, I'd like to discuss the development history briefly. So when Resident Evil was first released, it was a big success, and the studio already started working on a sequel. However, down the line of development, they decided to scrap the original version of the game. This version is known as Resident Evil 1.5. To this day, fans are still clamoring for a working copy of it. There are projects all over the internet dedicated to trying to finish Resident Evil 1.5. I've seen some of the locations and concept art of it, but personally, I don't think it would be all that great. I mean, if the studio thought it wasn't fun, it probably isn't. But we may never know. There were many design choices that did not make it into the final product, such as having your character show that he's damaged with like blood and brains all over his body. With all that said, however, I still think you should research Resident Evil 1.5, especially if you're a Resident Evil fan and you haven't heard of it. I don't know how you haven't, but read up about it. There's some pretty interesting stuff here. Now, the gameplay of Resident Evil 2 is nearly identical to the original. There are a few tweaks here and there to improve it, but overall, the gameplay didn't really need to be improved all that much. Everything about this game feels great. The tank controls, the action, and the puzzle solving. The puzzles, especially in Resident Evil 2, are just as good as the original. They're not always difficult, but it helps to break up the action and it adds variety to the gameplay. The action is also no slouch. There's tons of great improvements to the action here. One of the main things being that you can now combine weapon parts together to get a more powerful weapon. Whether it be a higher rate of fire or just more power to it, you can get some pretty devastating guns along the way. Like the custom shotgun, that can completely blow off a whole side of a zombie with one blow. It is absolutely amazing. Another thing that helps the action feel more refined is the zombie AI. If you go back and play the original Resident Evil, the zombies are pretty stupid, and they're easy to exploit. Here in Resident Evil 2, not only is there a lot more of them, but it's a lot harder to maneuver around them. Oftentimes, you're either gonna have to take a bite or shoot them all. There's also the addition of new monsters throughout the game, which are just as cool as the original as well. The Lickers are horrifying beasts to look at. I love their design. They got like the exposed brain and this like 20-foot tongue. It's pretty spooky. And when you see your very first Licker, it is still pretty creepy to this day. Easily the two most improved aspects about Resident Evil 2 are the story and the setting. I said in my Resident Evil 1 review that it's like an old cheesy horror film, with its B-movie traits like bad voice acting and a very simple plot. However, all that still adds to the charm of the original Resident Evil. But with the second game, the feeling is different, and I think I know why. It's the complete dismissal of full motion video. Even though it was only in the introduction and the ending of the original Resident Evil, when you see FMV, it already makes it feel cheesy, and that's not always a good thing. 99% of games that were all about the gimmick of FMV don't hold up very well at all. A lot of times, they weren't even games, it was more like an interactive movie. There wasn't very much gameplay to it. Eventually, games were able to use CG cutscenes and full motion video faded away, thank God. And even though these cutscenes aren't jaw-dropping anymore, it doesn't have the same feeling that FMV does. The voice acting has also been improved from the original. I mean, when you go back and play the original, it's very hokey. It's bad, but like I said, it adds to the charm of it.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Who are you? What are you doing here?
Hold your fire! I'm a human!
While it's not A-list material, it's still leagues better than the original. Now the story here is presented through two different perspectives, one as Leon Kennedy and one as Claire Redfield. Now Claire Redfield is actually Chris Redfield's sister, who's from the first Resident Evil. Pretty cool. But the thing that makes it really cool is that since there's two different perspectives, you're going to see two sides of the story. So you're going to see different locations, you might see some different enemies, different items, different weapons, and you might meet some different people along the way. It is a really cool thing because it gives the game replayability. So there are really two different scenarios to play. There's Scenario A and Scenario B. Scenario B being unlocked after you beat Scenario A for whichever character. You can do it in any order that you want to. Now the thing that makes the story really cool, especially in Scenario B, is that you have monsters that stalk you throughout the entire game. Now, unlike Resident Evil 3, these moments are scripted instead of just random, but it's still creepy and cool to see. I can't actually go into too much detail, because there was a remake that came out earlier this year, and a whole new generation is experiencing Resident Evil 2 for the first time. If I went into too much detail about the story here, I would also be spoiling the remake, which I don't want to do. But I will say this, if you have played the remake and you have not played the original, go back and play it. And if you have not played the remake yet, go and play it. They're both amazing. But I will end with this last statement. I really wish we got to see another Resident Evil game that's like the classic Resident Evil style. The fixed camera angles, the tank controls, that is Resident Evil at its best. As much as I love Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 7, and the remake of Resident Evil 2, I would love to see it go back to its roots like this, because these games are just awesome.